while Gehrig was honored by friends, family, and teammates, including one with whom he had not spoken since 1934.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth. I might have been given a bad break, but I've got an awful lot to live for. Thank you.
This is a big deal. Big deal for us, big deal for the Chautauqua Striders, and big deal for those folks in the community because we have a moment in time. The moment in time is that we are able today to listen to Jonathan Eig. Jonathan Eig wrote the book The Luckiest Man, The Life and Death of Lou Gehrig, and this is occurring on the 75th anniversary of his speech at Yankee Stadium. This is incredibly serendipitous that we were able to do this tonight, where we're able to collaborate with the Chautauqua Striders, an organization which has had tremendous success in working with student athletes, and to be able to marry education and activities with the knowledge that athletics is okay and one of the real touchstones for taking it to the next level. So we're delighted to be here. Now, who are we? We are a group of people from Chautauqua Institution. We're here annually to memorialize and celebrate the life of Joe Raitt. Joe Raitt, a long-standing Chautauquan, long-standing fan of baseball, long-standing fan of educational opportunities, long-standing fan of the Robert H. Jackson Center. That's good. And for all those reasons, many years ago, Mark Altschiller, myself, and a few others, together with Joe, started an annual event to come to bring Chautauquans to enjoy this rite of passage called baseball. So it's more than adequate tonight that we're able to pause, celebrate the life of Joe Raitt here at the Jammers Stadium. And of course, Joe was a baseball fan, Joe was a Yankees fan, and Joe's would be so thrilled to have Jonathan Eig here among us. And I just want to call out Barbara Raitt, Joe's widow, is here, Peter, son, and we have also grandchildren, Jake, Emma, and May. Jake, where are they? Raise your hand. He's warming up in the bullpen. Terrific. This guy is a big deal. He has written several best-selling books, including Jackie Robinson, which is incredibly well received, not only publicly, but the family as well, as we just had Sharon here not that long ago. Did a wonderful book on Al Capone, and of course did this best-selling book called The Luckiest Man. So without further ado, Jonathan Eig.
Thank you so much, and thanks to Greg and to Mark and everybody in Chautauqua for bringing me here and making me feel so welcome every time I come to visit. It was 75 years ago, almost to the day, that Lou Gehrig stood on a field, Yankee Stadium, right at home plate in front of a microphone, not very different from this one, 61,000 people in the audience, and declared himself the luckiest man on the face of the earth. As a kid, growing up as a Yankee fan, I didn't know that much about Gehrig. I knew that he was a good-looking guy. I knew he played first base. I knew he was the greatest first baseman of all time. I knew he played in 2,130 consecutive games, and I knew that he made this speech and that he died young. But, you know, as a kid, what do you really know about that? He was in his 30s. I figured, well, that's pretty good for a grown-up. 35 is old as hell. So it didn't strike me just how tragic that was until, obviously, I was a little bit older. And also, when I became an adult and I began to think about Gehrig, I thought, why did he call himself the luckiest man on the face of the earth? Even to an adult, that's not obvious. Because he knew he was dying. He had this disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, that melts your muscles away. It's one of the worst diseases you can ever get, and it's just such a slow and painful death, especially for a man who was so proud of his body, the Iron Horse, everyone called him, because he was so big and so strong and so reliable. So I became curious, what did he mean by luckiest man, and who was this man really? Besides the ball player, and besides the stats, besides the little information you can see on the back of a baseball card, what could I learn about him? And that's where my journey really began. I just started researching the man's life. I had in mind that it would be cool to write a book about him, but really I began just immersing myself, trying to find out who this guy was. And when you look at the details of his life, it's very difficult. He was a very shy man. He did not give a lot of interviews. Babe Ruth, his teammate on the Yankees, of course, was the most famous man in the world at his time, and wrote an autobiography like every season because he needed more money. Gehrig had offers but would never tell his story. He just preferred to really stay in the shadows of Ruth, and Ruth cast a large shadow, literally and figuratively. But Gehrig grew up very poor in New York City to German immigrant parents. He was one of 4 children, the only one who survived. His mother lost 3 children. So his mother put this unbelievable amount of pressure on Lou to be big and to be strong and healthy and to be her good boy. And Lou, as a result of that, really grew up incredibly shy, incredibly introverted, afraid really to do anything that would upset his mother. This is okay when you're a little kid, but when you're 27 years old and you're playing first base for the Yankees and it's the roaring 20s, the jazz age, and you're hanging around with Babe Ruth, all these opportunities present themselves to have a lot of fun. And I'll keep it clean because my daughter's here. But he could have had a really good time. He was an incredibly handsome man and one of the most eligible bachelors in New York. But what did Lou Gehrig do after these ball games? And the ball games were all played in the daytime back then, remember. So by 5 o'clock, these guys were free to go rattle around New York City. Gehrig went home every night to help his mother make dinner, to help set the table. And if he wanted to have some fun after dinner, he'd go out into the street and just play catch with the boys in the neighborhood, the 9-year-olds, the 10-year-olds. This is the kind of guy he was. So I'm researching his life. I'm getting to know him. I'm really wondering what makes him tick. Why can't he escape from his mother's apron strings a little more? I see him go from this rookie, this kid, Columbia College graduate, to being the star of the Yankees, second only to Ruth. 1927, Ruth and Gehrig become the 2 most famous ball players on the planet as they're chasing the all-time home run record, Ruth's home run record. Ruth goes on to break it, hitting 60 home runs that year. Gehrig falls off just a little bit at the end of the season because his mother's sick and he's worried about her. But even when he becomes this incredibly famous guy, he still avoids the spotlight altogether. Finally, when he's 30 years old, he meets a woman. He meets her in Chicago, a safe distance from his mother, I should remind you. His mother had broken up several relationships prior to this. She said, "No, Lou, it's over." And he said, "Okay, Mom." He would stop dating the girl. But he meets a girl in Chicago. He instantly asks her to marry him. And she immediately says yes. They agree to get married. And when Ma Gehrig finds out about it, she throws a fit. But Lou says he's going to stick to it this time. He's going to stand by this girl. And I start to see Lou coming out of his shell a little bit. And it's so nice to see him maturing, gaining some confidence. He begins to enjoy things like the theater and the opera. And Eleanor really urges him, to take more pride in himself, to be more confident. Gehrig would always sneak in and out of Yankee Stadium because he didn't like the attention. And people thought he was rude, that he didn't want to sign autographs for the fans. He wasn't rude, he was just unbelievably shy. Eleanor said, "No, you're going in the front door. You're going in the player's gate, not through the trainer's equipment room. And you're going to sign those autographs." And Gehrig would also, every year, send his contract back, sign it instantly without even reading it. Whatever the Yankees offered him that year, he would accept it. Can you imagine a ball player today just taking whatever was offered? Eleanor said, "No, you're going to negotiate. You deserve a raise." Eleanor also encouraged him to audition for a movie part and to hire an agent. Does anybody know what movie Gehrig auditioned for? If you've read my book, you know. He tried out to be Tarzan. And you'll see the pictures in the book. He's wearing this skimpy loincloth. His legs are enormous. And in fact, he did not get the part because the director said his legs were too big. It would be scary to women. That's how muscular this guy was. And he ended up starring in a cowboy western, by the way, which you can probably get on Netflix. It's called Rawhide. It's worth seeing. It's a cowboy musical. He doesn't sing, fortunately. It's dubbed. But I'm watching Gehrig mature. I'm watching him come into his own. Ruth retires, and Gehrig becomes the captain and the leader of the team. They win World Series without Babe Ruth. Gehrig continues this streak that he's so proud of, playing every game for 13, 14 years in a row. And of course, I know what's coming next. I know that soon he's going to start to get ill, and I'm dreading this as I'm researching this. And in 1938, after he got done filming this cowboy musical, this cowboy western, he reports to spring training and starts to say that he's having some problems. He's having some cramps in his legs and some blisters on his hands. And he tapes some foam to the bottom of his bat because the bat's hurting his hands so much. And I'm thinking, I wonder if that's the ALS. I wonder if one of the very first things that happens with Lou Gehrig's disease, as we call it now, is that the small muscles in your hands and in your feet start to melt away. So people try to squeeze things harder, and they fumble with it more often. If you talk to somebody with ALS, they might say the first thing they noticed was that they were dropping their keys a lot, or having trouble getting it in the lock of their door, or that they were tripping over their own feet because the small muscles in the feet begin to go. Gehrig is reporting some of these symptoms as early as the spring training of 1938. And over the course of the 1938 season, he starts ordering lighter baseball bats. I found the orders in the archives of the Louisville Slugger Company. So we know that his muscles are starting to deteriorate. He plays the entire 1938 season, every game. Does anybody care to guess, without looking in the back of the book, what kind of stats he put up that year? Good ones, yes. Good guess. He hit 295, 114 RBIs with 29 homers with ALS. I think that's the greatest individual season in baseball history. It's the opposite of using steroids. Your muscles are literally melting away day by day. And he hit 295 with 114 RBIs and 29 home runs and led the Yankees to the World Series. But when the season was over and after the last game of the World Series, Gehrig did something he'd never done before in public. He got drunk. He knew something was wrong with his body and he just couldn't handle it anymore. He was getting so frustrated. When the season ended, he went to some doctors and nobody could diagnose what was wrong with him. So he reported for spring training in the spring of 1939. He had never missed even a spring training game. That's how obsessive he was about this streak. You know, he's a German, very disciplined. And he also wanted to show that he was not Babe Ruth, who was always, taking a day off because he was hungover. Ruth was so proud of this streak. But finally, in spring training of 1939, he took a couple days off. He said he just didn't feel right. When the first game of the season started, of course, he was in the lineup, and he played the first week or so. Finally, he took himself out of the lineup because he said he was embarrassing the team. He was actually couldn't stand to hurt the team anymore. There were routine ground balls that were going through his legs. His teammates were afraid to throw the ball to him at first base because they didn't think he could get his glove up in time. This is how bad he looked. And the press all said, "What the hell is wrong with Gehrig?" The reporters were all saying, "It's like he's aged overnight. Maybe playing every game for 14 years, you don't age normally. Maybe you just age all at once." This was the kind of speculation that was going on in the newspaper. So he took himself out of the lineup, thought that maybe taking a little time off would make him feel better, rejuvenate his strength, thought maybe he had a virus of some kind. But when he didn't feel better, he finally decided it was time to go see a doctor at the Mayo Clinic. And he'd been to see doctors before, but never the kind of neurologists. Neurologists were pretty rare back then. He'd never been referred to one. But finally at the Mayo Clinic, he went to see a neurologist. And the minute he walked in the office, took off his shirt, the neurologist knew it was ALS. It was so obvious. With ALS, what happens is the muscles tend to melt away, but they melt away unevenly, more on one side than the other. That's what the amio means. Lateral means uneven. So Gehrig was told that this was a fatal disease, that most people lived no more than a couple of years with it, and certainly knew that he was done playing. He came back to New York with a letter to the Yankees explaining what this disease meant and why he couldn't play anymore. And the Yankees decided they wanted to honor him, and that's why they had this game in between games of a doubleheader on July 4th, 1939, Washington Senators, 61,000 people there, and all of Gehrig's former teammates from the 1927 Yankees, including Babe Ruth, came out to honor him. The mayor of New York, Fiorello LaGuardia, was there, and they all made speeches. They presented Gehrig with these gifts, and because he was so shy, he told his manager he really did not want to speak. He preferred just to wave to the crowd and thank everybody and walk away, but the crowd was roaring, "We want Lou, we want Lou." And finally, his manager, Joe McCarthy, whispered in his ear and gave him a shove up to the microphone. And we don't know if Gehrig prepared any remarks. We don't know if he thought about it the night before. We don't know if he had anything written out. I suspect that he had certainly thought about what he would say because he was such a careful, such a thoughtful man, and he didn't like to be unprepared for anything. And if you think about the words that he uttered that day, they sound like someone who'd given some thought to what he wanted to get across. And what he said was, "For the past 2 weeks you've been reading about a bad break. Yet today I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth." Who wouldn't consider themselves lucky to have been a Yankee, to have played with all these fine men that you see on the field here today? Who wouldn't consider themselves lucky to have a wife like mine, to have a mother and a father who raised me to be big and strong and to be a good person? Even my mother-in-law sides with me and fights with her daughter, he says. He starts a little joke. He goes on to thank the opponents who sent him gifts, to think that all these years he'd hated the New York Giants and here they were sending him gifts. He was so moved by that. He thanks the ushers. He thanks the groundskeepers. And then at the end he says, so while I might have been given a bad break, I have an awful lot to live for. And he puts his head down and takes his baseball cap in his hands and scrunches it and walks off the field. And as you know, in the Gary Cooper movie, Pride of the Yankees, that's the last thing we see. And for most people who know about Lou Gehrig, that's the last thing they know. It's the last image that we have in our heads. But Gehrig lived for another 2 years. And I set out to research those years, to find out what kind of a man he really was, how he faced that illness, because more than the baseball, I was interested in how he handled that challenge. He spoke so eloquently, but then he had to go off and deal with this thing on his own. And in the course of my research, I found 200 pages of letters that Gehrig had written to his doctor as he was dying, letters that nobody had ever seen before. And as I said when I began this talk, I began not knowing very much about Lou Gehrig and hoping that I would like who I found. And even when I heard these letters existed and when I was waiting to get my hands on them, I became concerned. What if the Gehrig who's revealed in these letters is not the man that I had him cracked up to be? What if he reveals himself to be depressed, angry? He would have been entitled to those feelings. What if he revealed himself to be a Dodger fan of all things? You know, it could have been really sad. But in these letters, Gehrig is so strong. He goes on to talk to his doctor about all these experimental treatments that he's undergoing, and how even though he believes that they're not doing anything for him, there's hope that maybe they'll work for the next guy. And when it becomes really clear that this isn't working, that his muscles are melting away, and he describes it in such painful detail about all the different parts of his body beginning to fail, even when he knows that death is coming soon for him, he begins using these letters to ask for favors from the doctor for other people in his life. His wife is under so much stress, she's breaking out in rashes. Is there something you can send her? One of his teammates' wives is having stomach trouble. Can you recommend a good doctor here in New York? He turns his attention to other people. And I fell in love with Gehrig reading these letters, even more than I had fallen in love with him as a Yankee fan as a child, and even more than I had in researching his amazing career. And when I think about those words, when I think about Gehrig calling himself the luckiest man on the face of the earth, I know now what he meant, and it's something that I think we can all relate to. And I know that patients, when they're diagnosed with ALS, their doctors often say to them, look, this is Lou Gehrig's disease. And it means something to them. It means that this is a disease that is associated with weakness, but we think of it in connection with this man of such great towering strength. And Gehrig gave us this message of hope. He said, no matter what happens, we all die someday. We all will lose our loved ones. But what you can focus on is the reasons we have to be lucky, the reasons we have to thank God for what life has given us. And that's what he was clinging to that day. That's what he was saying meant so much to him. So I feel like in that speech, in this brief 3 minutes that he spoke, he gave us all something that we can carry with us. And I'm just so proud to be able to carry on 75 years later and help reinforce and remind people of that message. Thank you very much. Time for a question or two. I can take a question or two, and then I will be signing books, and we will be giving a portion of each book sale to the Striders tonight. Yes?
Did he have any children?
Gehrig and his wife did not have any children, and it's one of the mysteries about him. He married a little bit late at age 30, but he never said why they didn't have children. His wife, in her memoir, said that they had been considering adoption when he got sick, but that's really all we know about it. Yes?
Could you discuss the movie Pride of the Yankees?
Sure. The question was, can I discuss the movie Pride of the Yankees? Part of the reason everybody knows this speech so well is, of course, that Gary Cooper delivered it, and it's the climax of the film. And the speech he delivered is a little different from the one Gehrig did. It moved that line, luckiest man, to the end of the speech in the movie. I was a little frustrated by that movie because Gehrig comes off as kind of a sniveling, wimpy guy. And it's really, it's a movie made for women, I think, because it was released during the war, during World War II. And, no, listen, it's true. Why do you think they put a dance scene in there? I mean, come on. It's because the men are all off at war in 1941 when the movie's released, and they got to sell tickets to women. So Eleanor really becomes the star of the movie. Gehrig's this wimpy husband who she's got pulling around on a leash, and she's taking good care of him when he gets sick, and there's this great dance scene. It's because the movie's really geared to women, but I thought Gary Cooper was too wimpy to really portray Gehrig. That's my biased opinion. Any more questions? All right, well, thank you all for coming, and it's really a pleasure to be with you here. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
On May 2nd, 1939, after playing in 2,130 straight games, the Iron Horse Lou Gehrig benches himself. Lou's statistics through April are the worst of his career. He has just 1 RBI and a .143 batting average. 2 weeks after his benching, Gehrig is diagnosed with the fatal disease ALS and is given 3 years to live. Upon hearing the news, the Yankees scheduled Lou Gehrig Appreciation Day for July 4th. Sports writer Shirley Povich recalls the scene.
The day was advertised as a tribute to Lou. There was such an outpouring of fans that every seat at Yankee Stadium was filled. And official after official and player after player of the Yankees came along and spoke into the microphone, and spoke of the great affection for Lou and what he meant to them. And Lou, standing by, actually stooped as he was.
Today, I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth. That I might have been given a bad break, but I've got an awful lot to live for. Thank you.
2 years after his speech at age 37, Gehrig succumbs to his illness. His time was cut short, but his legacy will live forever.
Enshrined at Cooperstown, Gehrig was the first athlete in any sport to have his number retired.
How do you know, there's several books on Lou Gehrig, there's articles, everything. What niche did you think you could fill that hadn't been filled?
Well, a lot of people, including my wife, said to me, you know, what makes you think you have a right to tell this story again? And I've gotten that from a lot of people. You know, there are these really hardcore Yankee fans. There are people who know everything about Lou Gehrig, and, you know, what gives me the right to come along and decide that his story is worth telling again? And I just felt like I'm a storyteller. I'm not, you know, a historian. I'm not the world's greatest baseball expert. But I know how to tell a good story, and that the Gehrig story, though it had been told many times, hadn't been told right, in my opinion anyway. And I was able to convince a publisher of that, and then I've been able to convince a lot of book buyers of that, because the book, you know, has found its own audience, and I'm really blessed and appreciative of that. But the fact is that, you know, part of my job, a big part of my job, is looking for stories that haven't been told in the right way. They may have been told before, and that's true of all of my books. You know, Jackie Robinson, Al Capone, Lou Gehrig, their stories have all been told many times before. But I felt like they hadn't been told right, and they hadn't been told completely, and that there was still information out there. And that's the other thing is, you know, my reporting, my research, I'm able to find new things that you know, others haven't unearthed.
The 3 books you've done, is the subjects well known. It's not like you've taken the subject not well known and made them known. They're well known, so you start off with an introduction, if you will. And what's the upside of that, other than perhaps the obvious is you have a name, Lou Gehrig, Jackie Robinson, Al Capone. What additional things are positive and from your perspective?
I think the upside is, as you said, these are familiar characters. So, you know, my name is not a brand. I'm not David McCullough. I'm not David Halberstam. So people are not coming to my books because it's a Jonathan Eig book. They're coming to it because they'd like to hear more about Lou Gehrig or Jackie Robinson or Al Capone, and I think if I'm beginning to get a reputation, it's that they can trust me to tell the truth, whereas some of these other stories, these characters have been mythologized over the years. So that's the niche I'm trying to carve out. So the upside is that you've got people who are already interested in these characters, and if you do a good job, they will buy and they will read the book, and then they will come back to you and tell you what they thought. You know, the downside is that people may look at it on the bookshelf if they're not a huge fan and say, well, I think I already know that story. I think I already know Capone from watching The Untouchables. I already think I know, you know, Lou Gehrig from Pride of the Yankees, and they may not be willing to give the book a chance. So there's definitely up and down sides to it.
What new archives became available to you, or what did you dig up that heretofore had not been grabbed?
The biggest thing was these letters that Gehrig wrote to his doctor as he was dying, and I didn't know that I was going to find that stuff until I was well into the book. So I had to do this book without knowing whether I had any new material to work with. And that was, it was a little scary that I might come up with just a rehash of all the old information. I felt like the Gehrig personality was really worth exploring, that it hadn't come through in the other books. So that was one thing I really wanted to do. But the coup really for me was discovering 200 pages of letters that Gehrig wrote to his doctor as he was dying. So these last 2 years of his life that had never been documented at all, and in many ways are the most fascinating, because this is when his real courage emerges. You know, his baseball career I knew I could write about. I knew that was well documented by newspaper reporters, and I could go back and figure out everything he did. I suspected I could even go back and figure out when symptoms began to appear of ALS, based on the box scores and the newspaper accounts of his playing on the field. But I didn't know whether I'd be able to describe what I considered the most interesting part of the story, and that was his illness. And it turns out that I was able to describe it in heartbreaking detail because of these letters that nobody had seen before outside of Gehrig, his doctor, and one autograph collector who had purchased these letters many years ago. The story that these letters told was just incredible, because I was a little nervous. What if these letters revealed that Gehrig was a crybaby, and that he wasn't as brave as he this is a horrible disease. If he'd complained about it and really just gone into depression, it would have been understandable. Or what if these letters revealed that he was a racist or an anti-Semite, or that he liked the Brooklyn Dodgers more than the Yankees? It would have been ugly. But the letters were beautiful and heartbreaking. On the Gehrig book, it's hard to think of any criticism I got. It was, I think people were really glad to see the story told again, and I think people, Yankee fans really responded to it. I was a little worried, because at times I make Gehrig out to be a bit of a wimp, and he's a real mama's boy. He's very insecure, and I think the image of him is not always a proud one, but that's part of watching his character develop. So I was a little worried that some people would not appreciate the fact that I humanized him in that way, but I didn't get much pushback.
This has been great. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
I appreciate it.
This was great. Thank you.
All right.